American Notes, Section 0. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. American Notes for General Circulation by Charles Dickens. Dedication and Prefaces. I dedicate this book to those friends of mine in America who, giving me a welcome I must ever gratefully and proudly remember, left my judgment free, and who, loving their country, can bear the truth when it is told good-humoredly and in a kind spirit. Preface to the first cheap edition of American Notes. It is nearly 8 years since this book was first published. I present it unaltered in the cheap edition, and such of my opinions as it expresses are quite unaltered too. My readers have opportunities of judging for themselves whether the influences and tendencies which I distrust in America have any existence not in my imagination. They can examine for themselves whether there has been anything in the public career of that country during these past 8 years, or whether there is anything in its present position, at home or abroad, which suggests that those influences and tendencies really do exist. As they find the fact, they will judge me. If they discern any evidences of wrong-going in any direction that I have indicated, they will acknowledge that I had reason in what I wrote. If they discern no such thing, they will consider me altogether mistaken. Prejudiced, I never have been otherwise than in favor of the United States. No visitor can ever have set foot on those shores with a stronger faith in the Republic than I had when I landed in America. I purposely abstain from extending these observations to any length. I have nothing to defend or to explain away. The truth is the truth, and neither childish absurdities nor unscrupulous contradictions can make it otherwise. The earth would still move round the sun, though the whole Catholic Church said no. I have many friends in America, and feel a grateful interest in the country. To represent me as viewing it with ill nature, animosity, or partisanship, is merely to do a very foolish thing, which is always a very easy one, and which I have disregarded for 8 years, and could disregard for 80 more. London, June 22nd, 1850. Preface to the Charles Dickens edition of American Notes. My readers have opportunities of judging for themselves whether the influences and tendencies which I distrusted in America had at that time any existence but in my imagination. They can examine for themselves whether there has been anything in the public career of that country since, at home or abroad, which suggests that those influences and tendencies really did exist. As they find the fact, they will judge me. If they discern any evidences of wrong-going in any direction that I have indicated, they will acknowledge that I had reason in what I wrote. If they discern no such indications, they will consider me altogether mistaken, but not wilfully. Prejudiced I am not, and never have been, otherwise than in favor of the United States. I have many friends in America. I feel a grateful interest in the country. I hope and believe it will successfully work out a problem of the highest importance to the whole human race. To represent me as viewing America with ill nature, coldness, or animosity, is merely to do a very foolish thing, which is always a very easy one. End of section 0. American Notes, Chapter 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Philippone. American Notes by Charles Dickens, Chapter 1. Going Away. I shall never forget the 1/4 serious and 3/4 comical astonishment with which, on the morning of the 3rd of January, 1842, I opened the door of, and put my head into, a state-room on board the Britannia steam packet, 1,200 tons burden per register, bound for Halifax and Boston, and carrying Her Majesty's mails. That this state-room had been specially engaged for Charles Dickens, Esquire, and Lady, was rendered sufficiently clear even to my scared intellect by a very small manuscript announcing the fact, which was pinned on a very flat quilt covering a very thin mattress, spread like a surgical plaster on a most inaccessible shelf. But that this was the state-room concerning which Charles Dickens, Esquire, and Lady had held daily and nightly conferences for at least 4 months preceding, that this could by any possibility be that small snug chamber of the imagination which Charles Dickens, Esquire, with a spirit of prophecy strong upon him, had always foretold would contain at least one little sofa, and which his lady, with a modest yet magnificent sense of its limited dimensions, had from the first opined would not hold more than two enormous portmanteaus in some odd corner out of sight, portmanteaus which could now no more be got in at the door, not to say stowed away, than a giraffe could be persuaded or forced into a flower-pot. That this utterly impracticable, thoroughly hopeless, and profoundly preposterous box had the remotest reference to or connection with those chaste and pretty, not to say gorgeous little bowers, sketched by a masterly hand, in the highly varnished lithographic plan hanging up in the agent's counting-house in the city of London. That this room of state, in short, could be anything but a pleasant fiction and cheerful jest of the captain's, invented and put in practice for the better relish and enjoyment of the real state-room presently to be disclosed. These were truths which I really could not, for the moment, bring my mind at all to bear upon or comprehend, and I sat down upon a kind of horsehair slab, or perch, of which there were two within, and looked, without any expression of countenance whatever, at some friends who had come on board with us, and who were crushing their faces into all manner of shapes by endeavouring to squeeze them through the small doorway. We had experienced a pretty smart shock before coming below, which, but that we were the most sanguine people living, might have prepared us for the worst. The imaginative artist to whom I have already made allusion has depicted in the same great work a chamber of almost interminable perspective, furnished, as Mr. Robbins would say, in a style of more than Eastern splendour, and filled, but not inconveniently so, with groups of ladies and gentlemen in the very highest state of enjoyment and vivacity. Before descending into the bowels of the ship, we had passed from the deck into a long narrow apartment, not unlike a gigantic hearse with windows in the sides, having at the upper end a melancholy stove, at which 3 or 4 chilly stewards were warming their hands, while on either side, extending down its whole dreary length, was a long table, over each of which a rack, fixed to the low roof and stuck full of drinking glasses and cruet stands, hinted dismally at rolling seas and heavy weather. I had not at that time seen the ideal presentment of this chamber, which has since gratified me so much, but I observed that one of our friends who had made the arrangements for our voyage, turning pale on entering, retreated on the friend behind him, smote his forehead involuntarily, and said below his breath, "Impossible, it cannot be," or words to that effect. He recovered himself, however, by a great effort, and after a preparatory cough or two, cried, with a ghastly smile which is still before me, looking at the same time round the walls, "Ha! The breakfast-room, steward, eh?" We all foresaw what the answer must be. We knew the agony he suffered. He had often spoken of the saloon, had taken in and lived upon the pictorial idea, had usually given us to understand at home that to form a just conception of it, it would be necessary to multiply the size and furniture of an ordinary drawing-room by 7, and then fall short of the reality. When the man in reply avowed the truth, the blunt, remorseless, naked truth, "This is the saloon, sir," he actually reeled beneath the blow. In persons who were so soon to part, and interpose between their else daily communication the formidable barrier of many thousand miles of stormy space, and who were for that reason anxious to cast no other cloud, not even the passing shadow of a moment's disappointment or discomfiture, upon the short interval of happy companionship that yet remained to them, in persons so situated, the natural transition from these first surprises was obviously into peals of hearty laughter, and I can report that I, for one, being still seated upon the slab or perch before mentioned, roared outright until the vessel rang again. Thus, In less than 2 minutes after coming upon it for the first time, we all by common consent agreed that this state room was the pleasantest and most facetious and capital contrivance possible, and that to have had it 1 inch larger would have been quite a disagreeable and deplorable state of things. And with this, and with showing how, by very nearly closing the door and twining in and out like serpents, and by counting the little washing slab as a standing room, we could manage to insinuate 4 people into it all at one time, and entreating each other to observe how very airy it was in dock, and how there was a beautiful port-hole which could be kept open all day, weather permitting, and how there was quite a large bull's-eye just over the looking-glass, which would render shaving a perfectly easy and delightful process when the ship didn't roll too much, we arrived, at last, at the unanimous conclusion that it was rather spacious than otherwise, though I do verily believe that, deducting the 2 berths, one above the other, than which nothing smaller for sleeping in was ever made except coffins, it was no bigger than one of those hackney cabriolets which have the door behind, and shoot their fares out like sacks of coals upon the pavement. Having settled this point to the perfect satisfaction of all parties, concerned and unconcerned, we sat down round the fire in the ladies' cabin, just to try the effect. It was rather dark, certainly, but somebody said, of course it would be light at sea, a proposition to which we all assented, echoing of course, though it would be exceedingly difficult to say why we thought so. I remember, too, when we had discovered and exhausted another topic of consolation in the circumstance of this lady's cabin adjoining our state-room, and the consequently immense feasibility of sitting there at all times and seasons, and had fallen into a momentary silence, leaning our faces on our hands and looking at the fire, one of our party said, with the solemn air of a man who had made a discovery, "What a relish mulled claret would have down here!" which appeared to strike us all most forcibly, as though there were something spicy and high-flavoured in cabins which essentially improved that composition, and rendered it quite incapable of perfection anywhere else. There was a stewardess, too, actively engaged in producing clean sheets and tablecloths from the very entrails of the sofas, and from unexpected lockers of such artful mechanism that it made one's head ache to see them opened one after another, and rendered it quite a distracting circumstance to follow her proceedings, and to find that every nook and corner and individual piece of furniture was something else besides what it pretended to be, and was a mere trap and deception and place of secret stowage, whose ostensible purpose was its least useful one. God bless that stewardess for her piously fraudulent account of January voyages! God bless her for her clear recollection of the companion passage of last year, when nobody was ill, and everybody dancing from morning to night, and it was a run of 12 days, and a piece of the purest frolic and delight and jollity. All happiness be with her for her bright face and her pleasant Scotch tongue, which had sounds of old home in it for my fellow traveller, and for her predictions of fair winds and fine weather, all wrong, or I shouldn't be half so fond of her, and for the 10,000 small fragments of genuine womanly tact, by which, without piecing them elaborately together, and patching them up into shape and form and case and pointed application, she nevertheless did plainly show that all young mothers on one side of the Atlantic were near and close at hand to their little children left upon the other, and that what seemed to the uninitiated a serious journey was to those who were in the secret a mere frolic to be sung about and whistled at. Light be her heart, and gay her merry eyes for years. The state-room had grown pretty fast, but by this time it had expanded into something quite bulky, and almost boasted a bay window to view the sea from. So we went upon deck again in high spirits, and there everything was in such a state of bustle and active preparation that the blood quickened its pace and whirled through one's veins on that clear frosty morning with involuntary mirthfulness. For every gallant ship was riding slowly up and down, and every little boat was splashing noisily in the water, and knots of people stood upon the wharf, gazing with a kind of dread delight on the far-famed fast American steamer, and one party of men were taking in the milk, or in other words, getting the cow on board, and another were filling the ice-houses to the very throat with fresh provisions, with butcher's meat and garden stuff, pale sucking pigs, calves' heads in scores, beef, veal, and pork and poultry out of all proportion, and others were coiling ropes and busy with oakum yarns, and others were lowering heavy packages into the hold, and the purser's head was barely visible as it loomed in a state of exquisite perplexity from the midst of a vast pile of passengers' luggage, and there seemed to be nothing going on anywhere or uppermost in the mind of anybody, but preparations for this mighty voyage. This, with the bright cold sun, the bracing air, the crispy curling water, the thin white crust of morning ice upon the decks, which cracked with a sharp and cheerful sound beneath the lightest tread, was irresistible. And when, again upon the shore, we turned and saw from the vessel's mast her name signalled in flags of joyous colours, and fluttering by their side the beautiful American banner with its stars and stripes, the long 3,000 miles and more, and longer still, the 6 whole months of absence, so dwindled and faded, that the ship had gone out and come home again, and it was broad spring already in the Coburg dock at Liverpool. I have not inquired among my medical acquaintance whether turtle and cold punch and hock champagne and claret, and all the slight etc. usually included in an unlimited order for a good dinner, especially when it is left to the liberal construction of my faultless friends Mr. Radley of the Adelphi Hotel, are peculiarly calculated to suffer a sea change, or whether a plain mutton chop and a glass or two of sherry would be less likely of conversion into foreign and disconcerting material. My own opinion is, that whether one is discreet or indiscreet in these particulars, on the eve of a sea voyage, is a matter of little consequence, and that, to use a common phrase, it comes to very much the same thing in the end. Be this as it may, I know that the dinner of the day was undeniably perfect, that it comprehended all these items, and a great many more, and that we all did ample justice to it. And I know, too, that, bating a certain tacit avoidance of any allusion to tomorrow, such as may be supposed to prevail between delicate-minded turnkeys and a sensitive prisoner who is to be hanged next morning, we got on very well, and, all things considered, were merry enough. When the morning came, and we met at breakfast, it was curious to see how eager we all were to prevent a moment's pause in the conversation, and how astoundingly gay everybody was, the forced spirits of each member of the little party having as much likeness to his natural mirth as hot-house peas at 5 guineas the quart resemble in flavour the growth of the dews and air and rain of heaven. But as 1 o'clock, the hour for going aboard, drew near, this volubility dwindled away by little and little, despite the most persevering efforts to the contrary, until at last, the matter being now quite desperate, we threw off all disguise, openly speculated upon where we should be this time tomorrow, this time next day, and so forth, and entrusted a vast number of messages to those who intended returning to town that night, which were to be delivered at home and elsewhere without fail, within the very shortest possible space of time after the arrival of the railway train at Euston Square. And commissions and remembrance do so crowd upon one at such a time, that we were still busied with this employment when we found ourselves fused, as it were, into a dense conglomeration of passengers and passengers' friends and passengers' luggage, all jumbled together on the deck of a small steamboat, and panting and snorting off to the packet, which had worked out of dock yesterday afternoon, and was now lying at her moorings in the river. And there she is. All eyes are turned to where she lies, dimly discernible through the gathering fog of the early winter afternoon. Every finger is pointed in the same direction, and murmurs of interest and admiration, as "How beautiful she looks! How trim she is!" are heard on every side. Even the lazy gentleman with his hat on one side and his hands in his pockets, who has dispensed so much consolation by inquiring with a yawn of another gentleman whether he is going across, as if it were a ferry, even if he condescends to look that way, and nod his head as who should say, "No mistake about that," and not even the sage Lord Burleigh in his nod included half so much as this lazy gentleman of might, who has made the passage, as everybody on board has found out already, it's impossible to say how, 13 times without a single accident. There is another passenger very much wrapped up, who has been frowned down by the rest and morally trampled upon and crushed, for presuming to inquire with a timid interest how long it is since the poor President went down. He is standing close to the lazy gentleman, and says with a faint smile that he believes she is a very strong ship, to which the lazy gentleman, looking first in his questioner's eye, and then very hard in the wind's, answers unexpectedly and ominously that she need be. Upon this, the lazy gentleman instantly falls very low in the popular estimation, and the passengers, with looks of defiance, whisper to each other that he is an ass, and an impostor, and clearly don't know anything about it at all. But we are made fast alongside the packet, whose huge red funnel is smoking bravely, giving rich promise of serious intentions. Packing cases, portmanteaus, carpet bags, and boxes are already passed from hand to hand and hauled on board with breathless rapidity. The officers, smartly dressed, are at the gangway, handing the passengers up the side and hurrying the men. In 5 minutes' time the little steamer is utterly deserted, and the packet is beset and overrun by its late freight, who instantly pervade the whole ship, and are to be met with by the dozen in every nook and corner, swarming down below with their own baggage and stumbling over other people's, disposing themselves comfortably in wrong cabins, and creating a most horrible confusion by having to turn out again, madly bent upon opening locked doors, and on forcing a passage into all kinds of out-of-the-way places where there is no thoroughfare, sending wild stewards with elfin hair to and fro upon the breezy decks on unintelligible errands, impossible of execution, and, in short, creating the most extraordinary and bewildering tumult. In the midst of all this, the lazy gentleman, who seems to have no luggage of any kind, not so much as a friend even, lounges up and down the hurricane deck, coolly puffing a cigar, and as this unconcerned demeanour again exalts him in the opinion of those who have leisure to observe his proceedings, every time he looks up at the masts, or down at the decks, or over the side, they look there too, as wondering whether he sees anything wrong anywhere, and hoping that, in case he should, he will have the goodness to mention it. What have we here? The captain's boat, and yonder the captain himself. Now, by all our hopes and wishes, the very man he ought to be. A well-made, tight-built, dapper little fellow, with a ruddy face which is a letter of invitation to shake him by both hands at once, and with a clear blue honest eye that it does one good to see one's sparkling image in. Ring the bell, ding, 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 the very bell is in a hurry. Now for the shore, who's for the shore? These gentlemen, I am sorry to say, they are away and never said good-bye. Ah, now they wave it from the little boat. Good-bye, good-bye. 3 cheers from them, 3 more from us, 3 more from them, and they are gone. To and fro, to and fro, to and fro again 100 times. This waiting for the latest mail bags is worse than all. If we could have gone off in the midst of that last burst, we should have started triumphantly. But to lie here 2 hours and more in the damp fog, neither staying at home nor going abroad, is letting one gradually down into the very depths of dullness and low spirits. A speck in the mist at last. That's something. It's the boat we wait for. That's more to the purpose. The captain appears on the paddle-box with his speaking trumpet. The officers take their stations. All hands are on the alert. The flagging hopes of the passengers revive. The cooks pause in their savoury work and look out with faces full of interest. The boat comes alongside. The bags are dragged in anyhow and flung down for the moment anywhere. 3 cheers more, and as the first one rings upon our ears, the vessel throbs like a strong giant that has just received the breath of life. The 2 great wheels turn fiercely round for the first time, and the noble ship, with wind and tide astern, breaks proudly through the lashed and roaming water. End of Chapter 1. American Notes, Chapter 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Philippone. American Notes by Charles Dickens, Chapter 2. The Passage Out. We all dined together that day, and a rather formidable party we were, no fewer than 86 strong. The vessel being pretty deep in the water, with all her coals on board, and so many passengers, and the weather being calm and quiet, There was but little motion, so that before the dinner was half over, even those passengers who were most distrustful of themselves plucked up amazingly, and those who in the morning had returned to the universal question, "Are you a good sailor?" a very decided negative, now either parried the inquiry with the evasive reply, "Oh, I suppose I'm no worse than anybody else," or, reckless of all moral obligations, answered broadly, "Yes," and with some irritation too, as though they would add, "I should like to know what you see in me, sir, particularly, to justify suspicion." Notwithstanding this high tone of courage and confidence, I could not but observe that very few remained long over their wine, and that everybody had an unusual love of the open air, and that the favourite and most coveted seats were invariably those nearest the door. The tea table, too, was by no means as well attended as the dinner table, and there was less whist playing than there might have been expected. Still, with the exception of one lady who had retired with some precipitation at dinner time, immediately after being assisted to the finest cut of a very yellow boiled leg of mutton with very green capers, there were no invalids as yet, and walking and smoking and drinking of brandy and water, but always in the open air, went on with unabated spirit until 11 o'clock or thereabouts, when turning in (no sailor of 7 hours' experience talks of going to bed) became the order of the night. The perpetual tramp of boot heels on the decks gave place to a heavy silence, and the whole human freight was stowed away below, excepting a very few stragglers like myself, who were probably, like me, afraid to go there. To one unaccustomed to such scenes, this is a very striking time on shipboard. Afterwards, and when its novelty had long worn off, it never ceased to have a peculiar interest and charm for me. The gloom through which the great black mass holds its direct and certain course, the rushing water plainly heard but dimly seen, the broad white glistening track that follows in the vessel's wake, the men on the lookout forward, who would be scarcely visible against the dark sky but for their blotting out some score of glistening stars, the helmsman at the wheel with the illuminated card before him, shining, a speck of light, amidst the darkness, like something sentient and of divine intelligence, the melancholy sighing of the wind through block and rope and chain, the gleaming forth of light from every crevice, nook, and tiny piece of glass about the decks, as though the ship were filled with fire in hiding, ready to burst through any outlet, wind with its resistless power of death and ruin. At first, too, and even when the hour, and all the objects it exalts, have come to be familiar, it is difficult, alone and thoughtful, to hold them to the proper shapes and forms. They change with the wandering fancy, assume the semblance of things left far away, put on the well remembered aspects of favourite places dearly loved, and even people them with shadows. Streets, houses, rooms, figure so like their usual occupants, that they have startled me by their reality, which far exceeded, as it seemed to me, all power of mine to conjure up the absent, have many and many a time at such an hour grown suddenly out of objects with whose real look and use and purpose I was as well acquainted as with my own two hands. My own two hands and feet likewise being very cold, however, on this particular occasion, I crept below at midnight. It was not exactly comfortable below. It was decidedly close, and it was impossible to be unconscious of the presence of that extraordinary compound of strange smells, which is to be found nowhere but on board ship, and which is such a subtle perfume that it seems to enter at every pore of the skin and whisper of the hold. Two passengers' wives, one of them my own, lay already in silent agonies on the sofa, and one lady's maid, my lady's, was a mere bundle on the floor, execrating her destiny, and pounding her curl papers among the stray boxes. Everything sloped the wrong way, which in itself was an aggravation scarcely to be borne. I had left the door open, a moment before, in the bosom of a gentle declivity, and, when I turned to shut it, it was on the summit of a lofty eminence. Now every plank and timber creaked as if the ship were made of wicker work, and now crackled like an enormous fire of the driest possible twigs. There was nothing for it but bed, so I went to bed. It was pretty much the same for the next 2 days, with a tolerably fair wind and dry weather. I read in bed, but to this hour I don't know what, a good deal, and reeled on deck a little, drank cold brandy and water with an unspeakable disgust, and ate hard biscuit perseveringly. Not ill, but going to be. It is the third morning. I am awakened out of my sleep by a dismal shriek from my wife, who demands to know whether there's any danger. I rouse myself and look out of bed. The water jug is plunging and leaping like a lively dolphin. All the smaller articles are afloat except my shoes, which are stranded on a carpet bag, high and dry like a couple of coal barges. Suddenly I see them spring into the air, and behold the looking-glass, which is nailed to the wall, sticking fast upon the ceiling. At the same time the door entirely disappears, and a new one is opened in the floor. Then I begin to comprehend that the state-room is standing on its head. Before it is possible to make any arrangement at all compatible with this novel state of things, the ship rights. Before one can say, "Thank Heaven," she wrongs again. Before one can say she is wrong, she seems to have started forward, and to be a creature actually running of its own accord with broken knees and failing legs, through every variety of hole and pitfall, and stumbling constantly. Before one can so much as wonder, she takes a high leap into the air. Before she has well done that, she takes a deep dive into the water. Before she has gained the surface, she throws a somerset. The instant she is on her legs, she rushes backward. And so she goes, staggering, heaving, wrestling, leaping, diving, jumping, pitching, throbbing, rolling, and rocking, and going through all these movements, sometimes by turns and sometimes all together, until one feels disposed to roar for mercy. A steward passes. "Steward, sir, what is the matter? What do you call this?" "Rather a heavy sea on, sir, and a head wind." A head wind! Imagine a human face upon the vessel's prow, with 15,000 Samsons in one bent upon driving her back, and hitting her exactly between the eyes whenever she attempts to advance an inch. Imagine the ship herself, with every pulse and artery of her huge body swollen and bursting under this maltreatment, sworn to go on or die. Imagine the wind howling, the sea roaring, the rain beating, all in furious array against her. Picture the sky both dark and wild, and the clouds, in fearful sympathy with the waves, making another ocean in the air. Add to all this the clattering on deck and down below, the tread of hurried feet, the loud hoarse shouts of seamen, the gurgling in and out of water through the scuppers, with every now and then the striking of a heavy sea upon the planks above, with the deep, dead, heavy sound of thunder heard within a vault, and there is the head wind of that January morning. I say nothing of what may be called the domestic noises of the ship, such as the breaking of glass and crockery, the tumbling down of stewards, the gambols overhead of loose casks and truant dozens of bottled porter, and the very remarkable and far from exhilarating sounds raised in the various state rooms by the 70 passengers who were too ill to get up to breakfast. I say nothing of them, for although I lay listening to this concert for 3 or 4 days, I don't think I heard it for more than a quarter of a minute, at the expiration of which term I lay down again, excessively seasick. Not seasick, be it understood, in the ordinary acceptation of that term. I wish I had been, but in a form which I have never seen or heard described, though I have no doubt it is very common. I lay there, all the day long, quite coolly and contentedly, with no sense of weariness, with no desire to get up or get better, or take the air, with no curiosity or care or regret or any sort of degree, saving that I think I can remember in this universal indifference having a kind of lazy joy, of fiendish delight if anything so lethargic can be dignified with the title, in the fact of my wife being too ill to talk to me. If I may be allowed to illustrate my state of mind by such an example, I should say that I was exactly in the condition of the elder Mr Willet after the incursion of the rioters into his bar at Chigwell. Nothing would have surprised me. If in the momentary illumination of any ray of intelligence that may have come upon me in the way of thoughts of home, a goblin postman with a scarlet coat and bell had come into that little kennel before me, broad awake in broad day, and, apologizing for being damp through walking in the sea, had handed me a letter directed to myself in familiar characters, I am certain I should not have felt one atom of astonishment. I should have been perfectly satisfied. If Neptune himself had walked in with a toasted shark on his trident, I should have looked upon the event as one of the very commonest everyday occurrences. Once I found myself on deck. I don't know how I got there, or what possessed me to go there, but there I was, and completely dressed too, with a huge pea coat on, and a pair of boots such as no weak man in his senses could ever have got into. I found myself standing, when a gleam of consciousness came upon me, holding on to something. I don't know what. I think it was the boatswain, or it may have been the pump, or possibly the cow. I can't say how long I had been there, whether a day or a minute. I recollect trying to think about something, about anything in the whole wide world, I was not particular, without the smallest effect. I could not even make out which was the sea and which was the sky, for the horizon seemed drunk, and was flying wildly about in all directions. Even in that incapable state, however, I recognized the lazy gentleman standing before me, nautically clad in a suit of shaggy blue, with an oilskin hat. But I was too imbecile, although I knew it to be he, to separate him from his dress, and tried to call him, I remember, Pilot. After another interval of total unconsciousness, I found he had gone, and recognized another figure in its place. It seemed to wave and fluctuate before me as though I saw it reflected in an unsteady looking-glass, but I knew it for the captain, and such was the cheerful influence on his face that I tried to smile. Yes, even then I tried to smile. I saw by his gestures that he addressed me, but it was a long time before I could make out that he remonstrated against my standing up to my knees in water as I was. Of course, I don't know why. I tried to thank him, but couldn't. I could only point to my boots, or wherever I supposed my boots to be, and say in a plainful voice, "Cork soles," at the same time endeavouring, I am told, to sit down in the pool. Finding that I was quite insensible, and for that time a maniac, he humanely conducted me below. There I remained until I got better, suffering whenever I was recommended to eat anything, an amount of anguish only second to that which is said to be endured by the apparently drowned in the process of restoration to life. One gentleman on board had a letter of introduction to me from a mutual friend in London. He sent it below with his card on the morning of the head wind, and I was long troubled with the idea that he might be up and well and 100 times a day expecting me to call upon him in the saloon. I imagined him one of those cast iron images, I will not call them men, who ask with red faces and lusty voices what sea sickness means, and whether it really is as bad as it is represented to be. This was very torturing indeed. I don't think I ever felt such perfect gratification and gratitude of heart as I did when I heard from the ship's doctor that he had been obliged to put a large mustard poultice on this very gentleman's stomach. I date my recovery from the receipt of that intelligence. It was materially assisted, though, I have no doubt, by a heavy gale of wind which came slowly up at sunset, when we were about 10 days out, and raged with gradually increasing fury until morning, saving that it lulled for an hour a little before midnight. There was something in the unnatural repose of that hour, and in the aftergathering of the storm, so inconceivably awful and tremendous, that its bursting into full violence was almost a relief. The labouring of the ship in the troubled sea on this night I shall never forget. Will it ever be worse than this, was a question I had often heard asked, when everything was sliding and bumping about, and when it certainly did seem difficult to comprehend the possibility of anything afloat being more disturbed without toppling over and going down. But what the agitation of a steam vessel is on a bad winter's night in the wild Atlantic, it is impossible for the most vivid imagination to conceive. To say that she is flung down on her side in the waves, with her mast dipping into them, and that springing up again she rolls over on the other side until a heavy sea strikes her with the noise of 100 great guns, and hurls her back, that she stops and staggers and shivers as though stunned, and then, with a violent throbbing at her heart, darts onward like a monster goaded into madness to be beaten down and battered and crushed and leaped on by the angry sea, that thunder, lightning, hail, and rain, and wind are all in fierce contention for the mastery, that every plank has its groan, every nail its shriek, and every drop of water in the great ocean its howling voice, is nothing. To say that all is grand, and all appalling and horrible in the last degree, is nothing. Words cannot express it, thoughts cannot convey it. Only a dream can call it up again in all its fury, rage, and passion. And yet, in the very midst of these terrors, I was placed in a situation so exquisitely ridiculous, that even then I had as strong a sense of its absurdity as I have now, and could no more help laughing than I can at any other comical incident, happening under circumstances the most favourable to its enjoyment. About midnight we shipped a sea, which forced its way through the skylights, burst open the doors above, and came raging and roaring down into the ladies' cabin, to the unspeakable consternation of my wife and a little Scotch lady, who by the way had previously sent a message to the captain by the stewardess requesting him, with her compliments, to have a steel conductor immediately attached to the top of every mast and to the chimney, in order that the ship might not be struck by lightning. They and the handmaid before mentioned, being in such ecstasies of fear that I scarcely knew what to do with them, I naturally bethought myself of some restorative or comfortable cordial, and nothing better occurring to me at that moment than hot brandy and water, I procured a tumbler full without delay. It being impossible to stand or sit without holding on, they were all heaped together in one corner of a long sofa, a fixture extending entirely across the cabin, where they clung to each other in momentary expectation of being drowned. When I approached this place with my specific, and was about to administer it with many consolatory expressions to the nearest sufferer, what was my dismay to see them all roll slowly down to the other end; and when I staggered to that end, and held out the glass once more, how immensely baffled were my good intentions by the ship giving another lurch, and their all rolling back again. I supposed I dodged them up and down this sofa for at least a quarter of an hour, without reaching them once; and by the time I did catch them, the brandy and water was diminished by constant spilling to a teaspoonful. To complete the group, it is necessary to recognize in this disconcerted dodger an individual very pale from sea sickness, who had shaved his beard and brushed his hair last at Liverpool, and whose only article of dress, linen not included, were a pair of dreadnought trousers, a blue jacket formerly admired upon the Thames at Richmond, no stockings, and one slipper. Of the outrageous antics performed by the ship next morning, which made bed a practical joke, and getting up by any process short of falling out an impossibility, I say nothing; but anything like the utter dreariness and desolation that met my eyes when I literally tumbled up on deck at noon, I never saw. Ocean and sky were all of one dull, heavy, uniform lead colour. There was no extent of prospect even over the dreary waste that lay around us, for the sea ran high, and the horizon encompassed us like a large black hoop. Viewed from the air or some tall bluff on shore, it would have been imposing and stupendous, no doubt, but seen from the wet and rolling decks it only impressed one giddily and painfully. In the gale of last night the lifeboat had been crushed by one blow of the sea like a walnut shell, and there it hung, dangling in the air, a mere faggot of crazy boards. The planking and the paddle boxes had been torn sheer away, the wheels were exposed and bare, and they whirled and dashed their spray about the decks at random. Chimney white with crusted salt, topmast struck, storm sails set, rigging all knotted, tangled, wet, and drooping, a gloomier picture it would be hard to look upon. I was now comfortably established by courtesy in the ladies' cabin, which, besides ourselves, there were only 4 other passengers. First, the little Scotch lady before mentioned, on her way to join her husband at New York, who had settled there 3 years before. Secondly and thirdly, an honest young Yorkshireman, conducted with some American house domiciled in that same city, and carrying thither his beautiful young wife, to whom he had been married but a fortnight, and who was the fairest specimen of a comely English country girl I have ever seen. Fourthly, fifthly, and lastly, another couple, newly married too, if one might judge from the endearments that frequently interchanged, of whom I know no more than that they were a rather mysterious runaway kind of couple, that the lady had great personal attractions also, and that the gentleman carried more guns with him than Robinson Crusoe, wore a shooting coat, had 2 great dogs on board. On further consideration I remember he had tried hot roast pig and bottled ale as a cure for sea sickness, and that he took these remedies, usually in bed, day after day, with astonishing perseverance. I may add, for the information of the curious, that they decidedly failed. The weather continuing obstinately and almost unprecedentedly bad, we usually straggled into this cabin more or less faint and miserable about an hour before noon, and lay down on the sofas to recover, during which interval the captain would look in to communicate the state of the wind, the moral certainty of its changing to-morrow (the weather is always going to improve to-morrow at sea), the vessel's rate of sailing, and so forth. Observations there were none to tell us of, for there was no sun to take them by. but the description of one day will serve for all the rest. Here it is. The captain being gone, we composed ourselves to read, if the place be light enough, and if not, we doze and talk alternately. At one a bell rings, and the stewardess comes down with a steaming dish of baked potatoes, and another of roasted apples, and plates of pig's face, cold ham, salt beef, or perhaps a smoking mess of rare hot collops. We fall upon these dainties, eat as much as we can (we have great appetites now), and are as long as possible about it. If the fire will burn (it will sometimes) we are pretty cheerful. If it won't, we all remark to each other that it's very cold, rub our hands, cover ourselves with coats and cloaks, and lie down again to doze, talk, and read, provided, as aforesaid, until dinner time. At 5 another bell rings, and the stewardess reappears with another dish of potatoes, boiled this time, and store of hot meat of various kinds, not forgetting the roast pig, to be taken medicinally. We sit down at table again, rather more cheerfully than before, prolong the meal with a rather mouldy dessert of apples, grapes, and oranges, and drink our wine and brandy and water. The bottles and glasses are still upon the table, and the oranges and so forth are rolling about according to their fancy in the ship's way, when the doctor comes down by special nightly invitation to join our evening rubber, immediately on whose arrival we make a party at whist, and as it is a rough night and the cards will not lie on the cloth, we put the tricks in our pockets as we take them. At whist we remain with exemplary gravity, deducting a short time for tea and toast, until 11 o'clock or thereabouts, when the captain comes down again in a sou'wester hat tied under his chin, and a pilot coat, making the ground wet where he stands. By this time the card playing is over, and the bottles and glasses are again upon the table, and after an hour's pleasant conversation about the ship, the passengers, and things in general, the captain, who never goes to bed and is never out of humour, turns up his coat collar for the deck again, shakes hands all round, and goes laughing out into the weather as merrily as to a birthday party. As to daily news, there is no dearth of that commodity. This passenger is reported to have lost £14 at Vinteuil in the saloon yesterday, and that passenger drinks his bottle of champagne every day, and how he does it, being only a clerk, nobody knows. The head engineer has discreetly said that there never was such times, meaning weather, and 4 good hands are ill, and have given in, dead beat. Several berths are full of water, and all the cabins are leaky. The ship's cook, secretly swigging damaged whiskey, has been found drunk, and has been played upon by the fire engine until quite sober. All the stewards have fallen downstairs at various dinner times, and go about with plasters in various places. The baker is ill, and so is the pastry cook. A new man, horribly indisposed, has been required to fill the place of the latter officer, and has been propped and jammed up with empty casks in a little house upon deck, and commanded to roll out pie crust, which, he protests, being highly bilious, it is death to him to look at. News: a dozen murders on shore would lack the interest of these slight incidents at sea. Divided between our rubber and such topics as these, we were running, as we thought, into Halifax harbour on the 15th night, with little wind and a bright moon. Indeed, we had made the light at its outer entrance and put the pilot in charge, when suddenly the ship struck upon a bank of mud. An immediate rush on deck took place, of course. The sides were crowded in an instant, and for a few minutes we were in as lively a state of confusion as the greatest lover of disorder would desire to see. The passengers and guns and water casks and other heavy matters being all huddled together aft, however, to lighten her in the head, she was soon got off, and after some driving on towards an uncomfortable line of objects, whose vicinity had been announced very clearly in the disaster by a loud cry of "Breakers ahead!" and much backing of paddles, and heaving of the lead into a constantly decreasing depth of water, we dropped anchor in a strange outlandish looking nook which nobody on board could recognize, although there was land all about us, and so close that we could plainly see the waving branches of the trees. It was strange enough, in the silence of midnight and the dead stillness that seemed to be created by the sudden and unexpected stoppage of the engines, which had been clanking and blasting in our ears incessantly for so many days, to watch the look of blank astonishment expressed in every face, beginning with the officers, tracing through all the passengers, and descending to the very stokers and furnacemen, who emerged from below one by one and clustered together in a smoky group about the hatchway of the engine room, comparing notes in whispers. After throwing up a few rockets and firing signal guns in the hope of being hailed from the land, or at least of seeing a light, but without any other sight or sound presenting itself, it was determined to send a boat on shore. It was amusing to observe how very kind some of the passengers were in volunteering to go ashore in this same boat, for the general good of course, not by any means because they thought the ship in an unsafe position, or contemplated the possibility of her heeling over in case the tide were running out. Nor was it less amusing to remark how desperately unpopular the poor pilot became in one short minute. He had had his passage out from Liverpool, and during the whole voyage had been quite a notorious character as a teller of anecdotes and cracker of jokes. Yet here were the very men who had laughed the loudest at his jests now flourishing their fists in his face, loading him with imprecations, and defying him to his teeth as a villain. The boat soon shoved off, with a lantern and sundry blue lights on board, and in less than an hour returned, the officer in command bringing with him a tolerably tall young tree, which he had plucked up by the roots to satisfy certain distrustful passengers whose minds misgave them that they were to be imposed upon and shipwrecked, and who would on no other terms believe that he had been ashore, or had done anything but fraudulently row a little way into the mist, specially to deceive them and compass their deaths. Our captain had foreseen from the first that we must be at a place called the Eastern Passage, and so we were. It was about the last place in the world which we had any business or reason to be, but a sudden fog, and some error on the pilot's part, were the cause. We were surrounded by banks and rocks and shoals of all kinds, but had happily drifted, it seemed, upon the only safe speck that was to be found thereabouts. Eased by this report, and by the assurance that the tide was past the ebb, we turned in at 3 o'clock in the morning. I was dressing about half-past 9 next day when the noise above hurried me on deck. When I had left it overnight, it was dark, foggy, and damp, and there were bleak hills all round us. Now we were gliding down a smooth, broad stream, at the rate of 11 miles an hour, our colours flying gaily, our crew rigged out in their smartest clothes, our officers in uniform again, the sun shining as on a brilliant April day in England. The land stretched out on either side, streaked with light patches of snow, white wooden houses, people at their doors, telegraphs working, flags hoisted, wharfs appearing, ships, quays crowded with people, distant noises, shouts, men and boys running down steep places towards the pier, all more bright and gay and fresh to our unused eyes than words can paint them. We came to a wharf, paved with uplifted faces, got alongside, and were made fast. After some shouting and straining of cables, darted, a score of us, along the gangway, and almost as soon as it was thrust out to meet us, and before it had reached the ship, and leaped upon the firm, glad earth again. I suppose this Halifax would have appeared an Elysium, though it had been a curiosity of ugly dullness. But I carried with me a most pleasant impression of the town and its inhabitants, and have preserved it to this hour. Nor was it without regret that I came home, without having found an opportunity of returning thither and once more shaking hands with the friends I made that day. It happened to be the opening of the Legislative Council and General Assembly, at which ceremonial the forms observed on the commencement of a new session of Parliament in England were so closely copied, and so gravely presented on a small scale, that it was like looking at Westminster through the wrong end of a telescope. The governor, as her Majesty's representative, delivered what may be called the speech from the throne. He said what he had to say, manfully and well. The military band outside the building struck up God Save the Queen with great vigour before His Excellency had quite finished. The people shouted, the Inns rubbed their hands, the Outs shook their heads. The government party said there never was such a good speech. The opposition declared that there never was such a bad one. The Speaker and members of the House of Assembly withdrew from the bar to say a great deal among themselves and do a little, and in short everything went on and promised to go on just as it does at home upon the like occasions. The town is built on the side of a hill, the highest point being commanded by a strong fortress not yet quite finished. Several streets of good breadth and appearance extend from its summit to the water side, and are intersected by cross streets running parallel with the river. The houses are chiefly of wood. The market is abundantly supplied, and provisions are exceedingly cheap. The weather being unusually mild at that time for the season of the year, there was no sleighing, but there were plenty of those vehicles in yards and by-places, and some of them, from the gorgeous quality of their decorations, might have gone on without alteration as triumphal cars in a melodrama at Astley's. The day was uncommonly fine, the air bracing and healthful, the whole aspect of the town cheerful, thriving, and industrious. We lay there 7 hours to deliver and exchange the mails. At length, having collected all our bags and all our passengers, including 2 or 3 choice spirits who, having indulged too freely in oysters and champagne, were found lying insensible on their backs in unfrequented streets, the engines were again put in motion, and we stood off for Boston. Encountering squally weather again in the Bay of Fundy, we tumbled and rolled about as usual all that night and all next day. On the next afternoon, that is to say on Saturday, the 22nd of January, an American pilot boat came alongside, and soon afterwards the Britannia steam packet from Liverpool, 18 days out, was telegraphed at Boston. The indescribable interest with which I strained my eyes as the first patches of American soil peeped like molehills from the green sea, and followed them as they swelled by slow and almost imperceptible degrees into a continuous line of coast, can hardly be exaggerated. A sharp keen wind blew dead against us, a hard frost prevailed on shore, and the cold was most severe. Yet the air was so intensely clear, and dry, and bright, that the temperature was not only endurable but delicious. How I remained on deck staring about me until we came alongside the dock, and how, though I had had as many eyes as Argus, I should have had them all wide open and all employed on new objects, are topics which I will not prolong this chapter to discuss. Neither will I more than hint at my foreigner-like mistake in supposing that a party of most active persons, who scrambled on board at the peril of their lives as we approached the wharf, were newsmen answering to that industrious class at home, whereas, despite the leathern wallets of news slung about the necks of some, and the broad sheets in the hands of all, they were editors who boarded ships in person, as one gentleman in a worsted comforter informed me, because they liked the excitement of it. Suffice it in this place to say, that one of these invaders, with a ready courtesy for which I thank him here most gratefully, went on before to order rooms at the hotel, and that when I followed, as I soon did, I found myself rolling through the long passages with an involuntary imitation of the gait of Mr. T.P. Cook in a new nautical melodrama. "Dinner, if you please," said I to the waiter. "When?" said the waiter. "As quick as possible," said I. "Right away?" said the waiter. After a moment's hesitation, I answered "No," at hazard. "Not right away?" cried the waiter, with an amount of surprise that made me start. I looked at him doubtfully, and returned, "No, I would rather have it in this private room. I like it very much." At this, I really thought the waiter must have gone out of his mind, as I believed he would have done, but for the interposition of another man who whispered in his ear, "Directly." "Well, and that's a fact," said the waiter, looking helplessly at me. "Right away." I saw now that right away and directly were one and the same thing, so I reversed my previous answer and sat down to dinner in 10 minutes afterwards, and a capital dinner it was. The hotel, a very excellent one, is called the Tremont House. It has more galleries, colonnades, piazzas, and passages than I can remember, or the reader will believe. Chapter 2